There was a version of us that felt simple in the way that only things feel simple, before they have been tested by anything real. Before the weight of everything we were each carrying separately started showing up in the spaces between our words, in the small hesitations that preceded things we used to say without thinking, in the way silence began lasting a little longer than it once had and carrying a little more inside it than silence between two people should have to carry. Back then, being around Olivia didn't feel like something Spencer had to think about or prepare for or manage carefully to get right. It just made sense in the uncomplicated way that certain presences make sense, the way some people fit into the particular shape of your life without requiring either of you to rearrange anything to make room. The kind of connection that didn't ask to be explained or justified or held up against any standard to determine whether it was the real kind or just the comfortable kind. The kind that felt safe without demanding anything specific in return for the feeling, that existed without the conditional quality that safety sometimes carries when it has been earned through enough disappointment to know it can also be lost. And maybe that effortlessness was exactly why it was so easy to believe in what they had, to let the belief settle in and take up residence without subjecting it to the kind of examination that might have revealed something more complicated underneath. Because nothing had tested it yet. Because the circumstances that would eventually reveal what it was made of and what it would cost both of them to try to hold on to it hadn't yet arrived to do their work. Because the version of them that existed in that uncomplicated early period was real and genuine and worth what it felt like it was worth, but it was also the version that existed before reality had introduced itself fully and asked them both what they were actually prepared to give. Somewhere along the way, without any single moment that could be identified as the turning point, things stopped being light in the way they had been at the beginning. Spencer had responsibilities that didn't leave space for the kind of openness and uncertainty that being genuinely available to another person requires, people depending on him in ways that had consequences if he got distracted. Expectations from multiple directions that had been present long before Olivia and would continue to be present, regardless of what he chose to do about what he felt for her. And Olivia was fighting battles that didn't always produce visible evidence of themselves, the kind that live inside a person quietly and shape their behavior in ways that are difficult to explain to someone on the outside looking for a clear and logical reason for what they are witnessing. The kind of internal struggle that makes you pull away from the people you most want to move toward, not because the wanting has diminished, but because some part of you understands that you are not yet in a place where what you have to offer is the version of yourself you want them to receive. So it wasn't that the feelings between them disappeared or faded into something less than they had been at their most present and most honest. It was that the feelings started existing in collision with everything else that was real in both of their lives, started pressing up against the practical and emotional realities that had been there all along, but had felt manageable to set aside when things between them were still uncomplicated. And suddenly loving each other wasn't simply about what they felt when they were together, in the easy moments that had defined the beginning of what they were. It was about timing, and about the readiness to hold something real, without the weight of everything else causing it to crack under the pressure. It was about whether either of them was genuinely in a place where they could offer what the other one needed, without depleting something in themselves that was already running low. They kept finding their way back to each other regardless of the distance that life placed between them or the time that passed between one return and the next. That was the thing about what existed between Spencer and Olivia that made it so difficult to simply let go of and move past. No matter how far things drifted or how much space they each tried to establish between themselves and what they felt, something in the connection refused to release its hold entirely. But every time they found their way back, every time the pull became stronger than the reasons they had constructed for staying apart, something in the timing was wrong in a way that neither of them had chosen, and neither of them could fix through the force of wanting it to be different. Spencer would arrive at a place of genuine readiness to stay, to commit to what was between them, without the half-presence that had characterized earlier attempts, and Olivia would still be in the middle of figuring out who she was and what she needed in ways that made receiving what he was offering feel more complicated than she could manage honestly. Or Olivia would finally reach a point of genuine openness, would find herself ready to let what she felt move forward into something real and sustained, and Spencer would already be so weighted down by everything pulling on him from other directions that meeting her where she was had become something where he couldn't fully do without shortchanging something else he was also responsible for. It was never a lack of love between them. It was the timing, always and specifically the timing. The way the moments when one of them was ready never seemed to coincide with the moments when the other one had arrived at the same place. Like two people standing in the same location, but at completely different points in their own individual journeys, reaching toward each other across a distance that wasn't geographical, but was no less real for being invisible. And that is the part of stories like this one that doesn't get talked about with enough honesty, the part that gets softened or skipped over, because it is easier to explain an ending through the absence of love than through the presence of love that simply couldn't overcome what surrounded it. Spencer loved Olivia in the way that some people love, steadily and with a groundedness that didn't fluctuate with circumstance or require constant renewal to remain what it was. The kind of love that is certain of itself, even when it is uncertain about everything else. And Olivia loved Spencer in a way that was completely honest, but still in the process of learning how to stand on its own without leaning on the relationship itself to provide the stability that she hadn't yet found in herself. But love doesn't pause the rest of life while two people figure out how to make their timing align. It doesn't suspend the external demands and internal battles and individual journeys that each person is navigating simultaneously, doesn't create a protected space where none of those things can reach in and affect what is trying to grow between two people who genuinely want it to work. And slowly and quietly, in the way that the most honest understandings tend to arrive, they both began to recognize something that neither of them wanted to be the first to say out loud. This wasn't falling apart because what existed between them hadn't been real or hadn't been worth the effort of trying to hold on to. It was falling apart because the reality surrounding it hadn't left enough room for it to exist in the form it would have needed to take to actually work, because the conditions that genuine love requires to sustain itself over time were not reliably present in either of their lives at the same moment for long enough to build on. So there was no dramatic ending with a single moment where everything broke at once, and the break provided the kind of clarity that makes it easier to move forward. No confrontation that forced all of it into the open and gave the ending the weight and the definition it might have deserved. Just a quiet and gradual understanding that settled into both of them with the patient certainty of something that had been true for a while before either of them was ready to fully receive it. That something can be genuinely right between two people and still not be meant to last, not because the love wasn't real, but because love alone cannot create the conditions that love requires to survive in. Spencer didn't stop caring about Olivia when the understanding arrived, and Olivia didn't stop loving Spencer, simply because they had both finally acknowledged what the timing had been telling them for longer than either had been willing to hear. But sometimes holding on begins to feel less like an act of love and more like an attempt to force something real into a moment it doesn't actually belong in, to make the circumstances accommodate the feeling rather than honestly assessing whether the feeling can exist within the circumstances as they actually are. And eventually, not with bitterness and not with a complete absence of grief, they stopped. Not because the feeling had gone, but because they had finally arrived at an honest understanding of what the feeling was and what it wasn't, and what it could and could not survive without. We were real in every way that mattered, and every way that would have been enough in a different set of circumstances. We were right for each other in the specific and particular ways that two people can be right, without that rightness being sufficient on its own to overcome everything that existed around it, just never at the same time. Some stories don't end because the love between two people fades into something less than it was at its most genuine. They end because the timing that love requires to become something lasting never learned how to stay long enough for both people to be ready at once. And that kind of ending, the one that has nothing to do with the love being wrong, is in some ways the hardest one to make peace with. Because there is no clear thing to point to as the reason. Only the quiet and honest truth that real and right and ready don't always arrive together, and sometimes they never do.